Hi folks, this is David Birchall and this is the first lecture pod for week 6 of Australian politics in spring 2020. 2 lecture pods for this week. Sorry for the late arrival of them. Had some health issues this week. The first pod is about the question of trust, and that's a current issue in Australian politics. I think it's been an issue for a while but has been rearing its head recently. And an even more topical issue for the second pod, the rise of populism, as it's sometimes described. I'll talk more about what that means in the second pod. And on the right-hand side of the screen there, you will, of course, see some familiar figures on the subject of populism. Donald Trump and his strangely lengthed tie at one of his rallies. Bottom right-hand corner, the tense relationship between Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd some years ago that seems to have coincided chronologically with a decline in trust in politics in Australia. So first, some thoughts about representative democracy and the question of trust, which takes us back to the last few weeks of the unit, and I'll try and stitch these things together as quickly as I can. As we've discussed before, representative democracy, which is to say the system of government by which the voters elect representatives who represent them in Parliament and then in turn go on, some of them at least, to form governments and become part of the executive, which governs. Representative democracy in practice removes voters from most political decisions. In ancient Athens, you could turn up to the assembly if you could spare the time and the money and vote yourself on some of the key issues of the day, whether to go to war or not, for instance, or taxes on grain, things like that. This is not the way we do things in representative democracies, of course, and there's history for that, which I will not take us through again. Rather, we vest these decisions in the people we elect to represent us in Parliament. Also, representative democracy separates the legislature from the executive. Though the executive is drawn from the legislature, the government has its own interests, as it were, which are not the same as the interests of Parliament as a whole. Governments are party creations, and their agenda is not necessarily the same as that of the collectivity of Parliament or indeed of the people. All of these aspects of representative democracy, necessary though we might think they are in the modern world, have provoked criticism that representation is not truly democratic, that we don't have enough say in how we're governed, even though ostensibly it's a democracy, and that politicians or governments, it is alleged, look after themselves rather than the public. This has been a common criticism over the life of representative democracy. It's not brand new, but it has reared its head in recent years as polls and surveys appear to suggest trust in politicians and government and even democracy plummeting in Australia and across the Western world. As in other representative democracies, Australians have traditionally held politicians in relatively low esteem. It's not absolutely clear why. There are different interpretations. One interpretation would say it's because we like to keep our politicians under control and under check by criticising them constantly. Another says that the business of politics is itself a fairly dirty business, and it's hard for politicians to poll well in surveys about reputations. However, even though politicians have never been popular as a species, and this was true back in the days of John Curtin and Ben Chifley, actually, it's not new. Politicians tend to improve in their popularity after they die, as the John F. Kennedy phenomenon shows. However, despite that fact, esteem in politicians and government appears to have fallen markedly over the last couple of decades. Why this should be so is a matter of controversy. You can look at different polls and surveys, and I've linked to 2 major sets of information about this on the View site for this week's topic, and they generally show a very similar picture. A gradual but steady decline in what's called trust, it's a common term, not the only term used, but a common term used in recent decades, in leading professions and institutions since the late 1960s. This is not actually confined to politics alone. I've stolen a graph here from a contribution out of a book I co-edited with this person, Andrew Lee, a long time ago now. But it shows possibly the most striking decline historically in the esteem of politicians between the mid-1970s and the early 2000s. It continued after that, but there's only so far it can fall. It hasn't fallen very much further below the 10% mark. And I will show you in a second a much larger graph that comes from surveys that the Roy Morgan Polling Company has done over a long period of time, which shows trust in the professions more broadly. Trust is not an easy thing to tie down precisely. It's a term that seems to have come out of American politics into ours. People did not primarily talk about issues of trust back in the 1960s, so far as I'm aware. Most commonly, it's defined to mean, when people respond to surveys about it, honesty, reliability, and a concern for other people rather than oneself. Telling the truth seems to be a major ingredient of being a trustworthy person. All this might seem obvious, but it needs unpacking. I think these are not all the same things. Honesty, reliability, and concern for others could be considered a package of admirable character traits, but they don't necessarily go together. And in the graph, which I'm about to show you in a second, in the next frame, these images of trustworthiness appear to correlate broadly against the occupations that Australians find most trustworthy. Pretty much always at the top of the list in modern Australian history since the 1960s have been the caring professions. And towards the bottom of the list nearly always have been people who are taking as selling things, whether that's selling products like advertising people or business executives, or selling themselves. They tend to be the least trusted professions and occupations. And politicians appear to be thought of as in the business of selling themselves, as well as perhaps the policies of their governments to the public, and therefore they get grouped with advertising executives and, wait for it, used car salespeople. There's been a lot of commentary about this over a long period of time. Why are politicians so distrusted? And what could they do about it to make themselves more trustworthy? I don't think there's a simple answer to this, and there are all sorts of obvious obstacles, I think, to politicians and people in the business of politics more broadly making themselves more trustworthy. Voters rate honestly highly, or at least that's what we say we do. Whether that's what our voting patterns show is another question altogether, but we say we rate honestly highly. But if you think about it, it's not very surprising that politicians often find it difficult to be honest. The Federal Treasurer, were he or she to be strictly honest about the economic forecast, could send the economy into a tailspin if the forecast is actually terrible. And would it always be wise, if you were pursuing a career in politics, to honestly tell an interviewer what you thought about the character of your party leader? I've put a significant photograph in the bottom right-hand corner of this screen to illustrate that. And actually, I might comment on that very briefly. Of course, one of the things that hampered Julia Gillard's prime ministership was the sense that she'd stabbed Kevin Rudd in the back. As you can see, I think from the photograph, Julia Gillard's own view of Kevin Rudd's leadership wasn't high, but of course she doggedly supported him in public until she and others deposed him because they thought he was a nutjob. And at that point, of course, Julia Gillard's own popularity went into a steep nosedive because she was seen as having been dishonest and untrustworthy in her relationship with her leader. But in all honesty, if you or I had been Julia Gillard, what would we have done differently? And here's the graph I was referring to a minute ago. Trust in professions and occupations. This is the Roy Morgan Polling Company. Roy Morgan's long had an interest in this question, going back to the 1960s, believe it or not. And periodically, that polling company has polled Australians on the occupations they regard as the most trustworthy and the least trustworthy. And you can see, I think, I'm very glad to say that university lecturers sneak into the top category there. below judges and police. But you see, for the most part, those people in the top category there, I think, are in caring professions or professions where we take them as being primarily concerned with serving the good of others rather than themselves. And if you look down, there's the in-between category there, where a lot of professions have settled, having fallen actually since the 1960s. The reasons for which would take too long to guess at, I think, here. Ministers of religion and business executives have their popularities plummeted, by the way, over the last half century. But down the bottom, you'll see the categories of people who are decidedly untrustworthy, most people think. You'll see union leaders, sadly, TV reporters, and federal and state MPs. Down towards the bottom of the list, they're not quite as low as stockbrokers, real estate agents, advertising people, or used car salespeople. However, surveys appear to show that trust is not just falling in politicians as a species, and you could argue we've always loved to hate politicians, it's not a new thing, but trust has fallen in government and even arguably in democracy itself. The largest and longest lasting social attitude survey in Australia is called the Australian Election Study, and it's conducted through a charmingly old-fashioned means these days of paper documents sent out through the mail, through snail mail. Still done, and it has in different forms. This has been administered that way since the late 1960s. And here you can see from a document that you actually find on the Views site, a figure from the Australian Election Study folks showing the trends over time in trust of government in Australia. Since the first one of those surveys in 1969, you can see that there was a dramatic fall in trust, I think around about the year 1975. If you know anything about Australian political history, that's probably not wildly surprising. And a few spikes along the way. Most important there was growing trust through the 1990s, and then a decline in the late 1990s, and then a rise again up until the election of the Rudd government, and then a steady decline again since about the year, as you can see there, 2008 possibly, which was the global financial crisis and also the beginning of the end of Kevin Rudd's prime ministership. We're not absolutely clear why this has happened or why there's been such a plummeting. If you look at that graph, it is very striking, the fall in trust in government over the last 10 to 15 years, but it has agitated political observers over that time. At least two different explanations have been offered. Firstly, there does seem to be a correlation between a decline in trust in government and the instability of governments over that time, ever since the fall of Kevin Rudd's prime ministership in the late 2000s. There's been historically unprecedented instability in government in Australia, and that is one possible explanation. Another explanation that's been offered is a growing lack of faith in the capacity of governments to deal with the major issues of the day, a sense that national governments can't deal with global issues successfully, whether that be the global financial crisis or whether it be, for instance, climate change. I should say no one has settled this question. These are matters for current debate. Lastly, the crisis in trust, if that's what it is, or at least the steady decline in trust, has provoked anxiety amongst political observers, political scientists, and indeed politicians themselves about the possibility of there being a crisis in democracy. And again, if you look, these are graphs I've nicked again from the Australian Election Study people, with thanks to them, Ian McAllister and others from the ANU and elsewhere. And you'll notice that according to their survey, since again the year 1969, there has been ups and downs in satisfaction with democracy. Again, you'll notice the years after 1975 appear to have been a dramatically unhappy period in satisfaction with democracy. But you'll notice the same phenomenon again, that since the accession of the Rudd government, or more particularly, I think probably the global financial crisis and the ending of the prime ministership of Kevin Rudd, there has been a fairly dramatic shift in people's expressed satisfaction with democracy. It's fallen from a high of 86% around about the year 2007 down to 59%. And a significant number, not that far short of a quarter of voters when asked, have suggested that other systems of government could be preferable in certain circumstances. That's unusual in Australian history and has led people to worry about the future of democracy. This has been a theme in almost every country in the Western world in recent years, but there have been differences. You probably can't see the table at the bottom right-hand corner very clearly, but you'll see that Australia sits in the middle there of a large list of countries in terms of satisfaction with democracy. The Scandinavian democracies seem untroubled by the so-called crisis of democracy, as oddly enough does Japan as well and New Zealand. United States, France, Germany, Australia, and the United Kingdom, however, have seen a declining support for democracy to the point where a significant minority of the population declare that they're not that pleased with it as a system of government. This is historically unusual amongst democracies. Sometimes it's claimed that this is a generational issue, and our old friend the smashed avocado story comes in here. Older Australians are in the habit of suggesting that young people nowadays don't appreciate democracy enough because they haven't had to fight for it. Actually, no Australian has had to fight for democracy really since 1945, which doesn't include baby boomers. And the evidence for this is mixed, but definitely younger Australians have been somewhat less enthusiastic about democracy in recent years. But it's not clear, last dot point there, and the last dot point of this pod, is still not quite clear. Does this suggest a crisis of confidence in democracy as a system of government? Would people actually prefer a less democratic system of government? There is a point of view, for instance, that says that democracy can't handle climate change well. It's a minority point of view, but it exists. Or does it actually suggest a desire for more democracy, as more optimistic commentators have suggested? Are people really saying that the democracy we have is not democratic enough? I have to say that not all of the survey data seems to suggest that latter interpretation, but this is still a matter for discussion and debate. We certainly live in an era where there are anxieties about democracy as a system of government. Whether this is a trend that will continue or just a blip of the last decade or so still remains to be seen.